Story 6. The Old Villager and the Journey Through the Inner Rings of Banic City. The old man's voice was like the creak of an ancient door, worn but steady, each word laced with the weight of years. His name was Marvin Ashlock, though most people just called him Old Ash. In his youth, he'd been a runner, delivering charcoal loads up and down the region. But his most famous tale, the one he loved to tell, and had likely told hundreds of times, was about the one time he travelled to Banic as a boy, delivering rare Ashburn charcoal to a noble's manor in the fabled Inner Ring. The boys had heard bits and pieces of it before, but tonight, as they gathered around the crackling fire in the huge stone fireplace, Old Ash decided to tell it in full. The old man stood up as best he could, leaning forward with his knotted hands animated. His sharp blue eyes, though dimmed by age, gleamed in the firelight. "Ah, Banic," he began, his voice thick with nostalgia, "the grandest city there ever was. You've heard the stories, the forges, the undercity, the nobles, with their golden goblets. But me, I saw it with my own two eyes. All of it. Well, most of it, anyway." The boys leaned in, their faces lit with anticipation. Old Ash took his time, as always, savouring their attention. "I was just a boy at the time, no older than Damien here," he said, gesturing toward the youngest of the group. "My father and I were chosen to deliver the finest load of Ashburn coal, the kind that burns hot and bright with no smoke, to a lord in the inner ring of Banic. Now, this wasn't just any charcoal, mind you. This was coal fit for a king's forge, special stuff, and you know what that meant?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. George finally asked, "What?" "It meant we were given passage through all the rings of Banic," Old Ash said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "All the way to the inner ring. That's a privilege most folk never get. Most don't even lay eyes on the gates, let alone pass through them." The boys exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even Ego, who usually kept his excitement hidden, leaned a little closer. "The journey started in the outer ring," Old Ash continued, his voice picking up again. "And let me tell you, that place is a madhouse. Muddy streets, people shouting, dogs and chickens running wild. It's chaos, but alive. You can feel it, like the whole city's a great beast, breathing and moving all at once. My father told me to keep my head down and my mouth shut, and I tried. I really did. But there was so much to see. Merchants selling everything you can imagine. Weapons, armor, and thousand things made of the finest steel. And spices, silks, strange trinkets from far-off lands. And the smells. Some good, some not so good." Damien grinned. "Did you get lost?" "Almost," Old Ash said with a chuckle. "But my father knew the way. And more importantly, he knew the rules. See, to get through the gates to the next ring, you had to have papers. Official ones, stamped with the Duke's seal. Without them, the guards wouldn't let you through, no matter how much coin you offered. And even if you had the papers, they'd still search your cart, ask you 100 questions, and give you a look like they were already planning to throw you in the stocks. My father told me to let him do all the talking, said the guards could smell fear and lies a mile away." The boys listened, spellbound. Old Ash leaned back, his gaze distant as if he could still see the gates before him. The first gate was iron, tall, black, and sharp as a wolf's teeth. The guards there were rough, but fair enough. They checked our papers, poked around the charcoal sacks, and let us through. The middle ring, though, that was something else. He shook his head slowly, as if he still couldn't believe what he'd seen. The streets were cleaner there, the houses bigger. The people wore fine clothes, and the markets, oh, the markets. My father had to drag me past a stall selling candied apples the size of my fist. But for all its beauty, the middle ring wasn't friendly. Everyone there seemed to walk with their noses in the air, like they were too good to even look at us. My father called them climbers, merchants and craftsmen trying to claw their way into the inner ring. He said they were the most dangerous kind, always watching, always scheming. Old Ash paused to catch his breath, his gnarled hands tightening around his cane. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence. "And then," he said, his voice quieter now, "we reached the gate to the inner ring. The Corona Altissima, they called it. The High Crown, it wasn't just a gate, it was a fortress. Walls of white stone, taller than anything I'd ever seen, with a portcullis of gleaming steel. The guards there wore armor so polished it shone like mirrors, and their eyes cold as ice. "What happened?" George asked, barely above a whisper. Old Ash smiled faintly. "They didn't just check our papers. No, they questioned us for what felt like hours. Who we were, where we came from, who the coal was for. My father answered every question, calm as could be. He told me later that the trick was to act like you belonged there, even if you didn't. Confidence, he said, that's what gets you through the gate." The boys sat in awed silence as Old Ash continued. "When we finally got through, it was like stepping into another world. The streets were paved with stone, smooth and clean. The air smelled sweeter, and the buildings, they weren't just houses, they were palaces, with marble columns and golden statues. And the people? They didn't just walk, they glided, like they owned the ground beneath their feet." He let out a wistful sigh. "We delivered the coal to a grand manor, bigger than our whole village put together. The steward didn't even look at us, just waved us toward the servants' entrance. But I'll never forget the sight of that place. Chandeliers of crystal, floors of polished wood, tapestries finer than anything I'd ever imagined." "And then what?" Ewan asked. "Did you meet the noble?" Old Ash shook his head. "No, lad. We left as soon as the coal was unloaded. My father said we didn't belong there, and he was right. But I'll tell you this, seeing Banic, all of it, from the outer ring to the inner, it changes a man, makes you wonder about the world, about what's out there." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "And if you ever go, remember this. Watch the crowds and your pockets in the outer city sprawl. Keep your head down in the first ring, your wits sharp in the second, and your confidence steady at each of the gates. That's how you get through Banic." The fire crackled again as Old Ash leaned back, his story finished. The boys sat in silence, their minds filled with images of towering gates, bustling streets, and golden palaces. For a moment, it was as if they too had walked through the rings of Banic.